Well, there's this concern that once we get later in this year, there may be some kind of slowdown or stoppage. So people are trying to bring stuff in.
Hi, once again, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. So glad you could join us. And as always, I want to remind you to make sure you like these videos, click on that bell icon to subscribe to the videos, and share these with others as well as we continue to grow our audience thanks to your help. I want to welcome aboard Mike Steenhoek of the Soybean Transportation Coalition. And we're going to talk about something a little bit different today because there have been some rumblings, Mike, that would be more related to coastal activities here. And we're talking about the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast, and it has to do with the International Longshoremen Association. It sounds like there is potential for a strike at the end of September if they don't get some things um, uh, mediated, I guess, between them and let's see, there is another organization that they would be involved with here. They refer to it as USMX, the United States Maritime Alliance. So they have not come together, and I wondered if you could explain to my audience here what it is that they're arguing about. What is the holdup here?
Well, so first of all, the we have a history in the United States where we have pretty large labor unions that represent the dock workers and the longshoremen who service our ports, and they're not just local; they will be more coastal wide. So on the west coast of the United States, there's something called the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, and they represent everything, all of the dock workers from San Diego, California, all the way through Seattle, Washington, and then they even have some representation into Canada, an affiliated union. And then you've got on the East Coast, as well as this extends to the Gulf Coast as well. So into the New Orleans area, to the Texas Gulf by Houston and other of those ports on the Texas Gulf, as well as the Great Lakes. You have a union called the International Longshoremen's Association. And so they're on one side of the bargaining table, and on the other side of the bargaining table, and in this case, it's on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes, is, as you mentioned, an organization called the U.S. Maritime Alliance. And their membership consists of the ocean vessel companies, as well as the entities that service the ports, that manage the actual ports. And most ports in the United States, it'll be a public entity, but then they will contract with a company to actually provide things like the cranes and the infrastructure and all of the logistics and administrative support to make that port operate. So, and then you have the longshoremen and the dock workers who actually are the personnel that actually unload those ships. And so you have a contract that will, and in this case, it's a 5-year contract that's due on September 30th. And so they're currently in the process of negotiating, and the two parties, at least according to their verbiage, are still considerably apart from one another. And the real point of contention, yes, it's cost of living, salaries and wages, because as we all know, the cost of things have gone up over the years, and so your paycheck years ago doesn't extend as much today. So that's certainly a part of it. But then there's always this lingering concern among the longshoremen and dock workers about the increased use of automation according to the ports, they want to use that to make their port operations more efficient and to be able to keep pace with the efficiencies that you're seeing at ports around the world in terms of the number of containers you can load and unload in a given period of time. And obviously, that's something that's of grave concern to the unions. They feel that will displace some of their jobs. And so that's really one of the big issues of concern, even more so, arguably, than wages and benefits. And so there is a real concern for those who rely on these ports to move product to our international customers. And so the two parties still appear to be far apart. And you've got this deadline uh, coming up on September 30th. And obviously, we hope it doesn't get to the point where there's a closure or any kind of strike or stoppage. So we're hopeful that both parties can come to an agreement that's beneficial to both parties, but allows commerce to continue in this important area of the country.
Apparently, they're afraid that some of the manual labor that's used to move some of the machinery around can be automated, as they referred to in the article that we're referencing here. That was from WorldGrain.com, I believe. They were talking about the use of autonomous equipment out there, and that would kind of come into the robotic realm, right? Where it could handle some of the repetitive duties out there on the port. And yeah, I mean that's kind of the case in just about every industry right now, Mike.
It is, and obviously we understand that, we want to have industries that can still pay a wage so that people can work, provide for their families, and we certainly understand that. And there is that inherent tension. We see it in agriculture where, now all of a sudden so many of our farm machinery, it's, yes, you still usually have a farmer still in the cab of the combine or the tractor, but so much of that is automatic right now, and it allows a farmer to get so much done more than what he or she would have done years ago. So we have that tension in agriculture, and clearly that tension exists when it comes to our various ports with our dock workers. So it's something that's been going on for years. There was a real big friction point years ago when, with the advent of the rectangular shipping container, um, which you see on ocean vessels today, and then and it's called an intermodal container because it can go from an ocean vessel onto a railroad car onto a truck chassis seamlessly without disturbing the freight that's inside it. And by that was such an important innovation by having this kind of Lego kind of approach to loading and unloading ships and moving freight around the country. But that was a concern for the dock workers because that it all of a sudden became more of a kind of an automatic process of of loading a ship. And years before the shipping container, you had freight that was carried in drums, in barrels, in crates. And so it was a much more elaborate kind of Tetris kind of puzzle when you were loading a ship, and it required a lot more manpower to do it, to really kind of figure out the appropriate way with all of these disparate shapes of products that freight would be transported in. So it required a lot more manpower. And then with the shipping container in the 1950s, the advent of it, all of a sudden you still needed dock workers, you still needed people to help load and unload ships, but it became less of a labor intensive process. So this goes back for a number of years, this kind of tension between technological advancements and the desire to still have people that can make a living working at our ports. And this is just the latest example of that, and it's not going to go away. It'll continue to be the case in the years to come, the next time there's another contract negotiation. So it's just something that we do expect. Our perspective is, both parties are certainly important. We would certainly want both sides to be able to come to an agreement that benefits both without interrupting freight that's coming into this country and leaving this country.
Let's, as I say, shuck it down to the cob here for the benefit of our farmers and producers out here that are watching this. Why should a farmer in Iowa care about what a longshoreman is trying to negotiate out there on the East or the West Coast right now? How could it potentially impact him?
When you think about agriculture and the soybean industry in particular, but even more broadly than that, we represent, farmers are arguably among the most international of entrepreneurs, even though so many of them are located in the middle of the United States, far removed from coastal regions. But because we have the ability to produce more food than we can consume within the United States, we have this history of exporting that surplus to international customers. And so that means you've got customers that are located halfway around the world. And for soybeans, over half of what is planted into the ground will ultimately be consumed outside the United States. So all of a sudden, it's not just a function of growing a crop to be successful. You have to have demand for that crop. But then when a lot of that demand is international, you've got to have a supply chain that can connect the two. And that means you've got to have a pretty efficient and predictable inventory of roads and bridges and freight railroads and inland waterways. That also includes our ports. And that's not only the infrastructure of our ports, but the labor that services those ports. So anytime you've got any kind of suspension of work or strike or anything like that, it really impedes our ability to meet international demand. And one of the things that we're very proud of in the United States is that over the years, we've developed this reputation, well-earned reputation, of being the most reliable supplier of food in the global marketplace. But one of the things that's continually impressed upon me is kind of the lesson or the rule about good reputations. Well, good reputations, they take years to accumulate, but moments to evaporate. So you have to work years and years and years to establish a good reputation, whatever it is. And in this case, it's our supply chain, our ability to deliver. But that reputation can evaporate in a pretty quick period of time if all of a sudden you are no longer regarded as a reliable supplier, that for reasons outside your own control. It could be just due to the fact that we've got tension on either coast. And in this case, it could be the East Coast or the Gulf Coast or the Great Lakes. And all of a sudden, when our customers no longer can count on us, they start exploring elsewhere, other opportunities, because they need to have a source of food to feed themselves with or to feed to their livestock. So it is something that's really critical for us, and we've spent a lot of time and energy and resources over the years building these international customers. And the last thing we want is for those international customers to call our reputation into question just simply because we've got these problems with our supply chain.
Well, I'm really glad I had a chance to get you on today to talk about this, because there is a bit of a delineation here too between what this group mainly works with and maybe the bulk grain shippers that a lot of farmers are used to seeing, where they just pour the grain into an open hatch on a big ship and they take off and go. Now, this is probably more related to containers. Is that right?
Yeah, and the similar phenomenon happens on the West Coast as well. But when you're talking about our export facilities that load ships, ocean vessels via bulk, which, as you mentioned, you're putting about, you'll typically have 5 to 7 cargo holds in that ocean vessel. Each cargo hold, will handle, 300, say, 1,000 bushels of, in our case, soybeans. So if you got a 7-hold, what's commonly referred to as a Panamax vessel, you're looking at 2.1 million bushels of soybeans, 300,000 bushels per cargo hold. Those facilities, they will operate, and there's a number of them on the lower Mississippi River near New Orleans, which is our number one export region. Those facilities will operate under a separate agreement, or they have a separate labor force. It might be their own employees, it might be a different union. So this is something that these type of facilities are exempt from this negotiation that we're seeing in the news media between the International Longshoremen Association and the U.S. Maritime Alliance. So fortunately, those kind of exports, which is the preponderance of our exports, occur via bulk. So they would not be affected by this. But we do export about 7 to 8% of soybeans occur via container. And so much of our consumer goods that we import or export occur via container. And these are the 20 or 40 foot in length. Those are the two most common shapes. Steel containers that, again, these intermodal containers that can go seamlessly from a truck chassis and then loaded onto a rail car, put onto an ocean vessel, and they're stacked so that you can get thousands of them on one vessel. those are the kind of shipments that would be affected if there was any kind of strike or lockout. And so those agricultural products that use containers to meet international demand. So there's kind of a particular customer segment that want to have soybeans or soybean meal or DDGs delivered via container. So obviously that would be impacted by that. And there's a number of locations along the East Coast, where we do export soybeans via containers. We send some out of New York, New Jersey, and some out of Baltimore and Norfolk, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. So there's a number of these places where that does occur. So those would be affected by that. And those companies and those customers that rely on that would be impacted by this. So it is something that, is obviously a concern for us. Again, we're hoping we don't get to that point. A lot of times with these negotiations, unfortunately, is they allow it to get to the precipice before they actually come to an agreement in order to ratchet up the tension and the stress to hopefully try to get one or the other sides to make concessions. Well, that's not very helpful for industries that are trying to meet customer demand halfway around the world. Because if you have this possibility of a stoppage or a strike, say on September 30th or October 1st after the contract expires, the time to move that product from the middle of the United States to a customer in Europe or North Africa or wherever it may be, that takes weeks to get there. So you kind of have to back up from that point of that delivery time. And so all of a sudden, you're going to start seeing, as we get closer and closer to that September 30th date without any resolution to these negotiations, that's going to start having impact on decisions for these exporters and whether they have to find alternative routes. And, we're already starting to see among our importers, more economy wide, there's this kind of strong demand pull happening right now to bring containers in to the United States for things like the Christmas holiday season so that we've got sufficient inventory for that. Well, there's this concern that once we get later in this year, there may be some kind of slowdown or stoppage. So people are trying to bring stuff in on the front end. So they've got all the inventory they need so that if a stoppage or a strike occurs, they'll be better positioned to weather it. So you're already seeing that kind of behavior already.
And farmers need to remember that it's not a one-way street, as you alluded to. I mean, it's not just exporting things out of here. Farmers and ranchers get a lot of stuff from overseas too that comes in by container. It could affect, it could affect things like crop inputs. It could affect things like machinery, parts, and all that sort of thing. And that could cause a crimp on the other side here, on the input side.
Yeah, the last several years, especially with the advent of COVID and all of the supply chain disruptions that resulted from that, it really shed a spotlight on the fact that supply chains matter, transportation matters. And all of a sudden people realize that things they kind of took for granted, it really requires a multi-step, multiple links in the supply chain to get that product to you. And it really doesn't matter with a lot of these products. And you mentioned machinery is a classic example of that. You can have 90% of a piece of machinery that's assembled here in the United States, but it has one important component part that comes from Japan or China or some other origination point. Well, if you don't have that final component part, then all of a sudden you don't have a tractor. The Americans saw that very vividly with cars during the COVID pandemic. Well, all of a sudden there weren't enough chips all of a sudden. Well, even though most of that car was either manufactured here in the United States or maybe lots of a big portion of it in Mexico, but that particular part, those chips, came from Asia. And so all of a sudden, you need to have all of it in order to have a car that you can drive off the lot. So there's a lot of examples of that. And so we have this very diverse supply chain in which we send stuff to them, stuff from there comes to us. And so it really just is incumbent upon us to have a supply chain that is predictable, that's reliable, and having some kind of peace when it comes to our ports, that's a big part of it.
Well, I'm really glad you could come on board and help clarify some issues here. So, again, September 30th appears to be the deadline, and it would be for the International Longshoremen Association, and that would be representing the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, correct? So far, the West Coast operators are not really involved in this at this point. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a different union and a different on both sides in a shipping association, and their contract was recently, they entered into a new 5-year contract that was last year, and so there's more serenity when it comes to the West Coast. But one of the things that we see a lot of times is all of these unions monitor each other, and if Union A got a really good deal and got a number of concessions, well, then Labor Union B wants to emulate that or even to exceed that. So it's not a surprise that all of a sudden you see an agreement happen over there, and all of a sudden it really impacts what's happening over here. So it's something that is to be expected, and we've seen it before.
And gee, how what a coincidence that it just happens to be coming right before an election too. Uh, Funny how that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, and so
Anyway, Mike, good to talk with you again.
yeah, and
I
so
appreciate all the information. Good stuff, as
absolutely.
always. Mike Steenhoek with us from the Soybean Transportation Coalition. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for joining us. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlin Bohling, and we'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Thanks for joining us on our Comstock YouTube channel. Don't forget you can also find us on Facebook and TikTok as well. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.